right, friends, so here we are again, back into the mix. So I think Dr. Matz and I finally had a powwow about this, and I think we figured out our trajectory, and so we are ready to rock and roll. So right now the game plan is I'll continue for a few more weeks and at least get you to the birth of the Southern Baptist Convention. Pastor Anthony's been talking about, how this class is the history of the SBC, and some of you may be thinking, are we ever actually going to get to the SBC? But that's my fault. So I'm going to try to attempt to get us right up to the beginnings. We'll say the labor pains, if you will, of the Southern Baptist Convention, and then Dr. Matz is going to carry us forward from there. So tonight, we're going to continue talking about the early Baptists in America. So 1600s, 17th century, kind of the birth of Baptists in America. Last week, we talked about Roger Williams, okay? So just a quick recap. So if you remember, Roger Williams is the person who is usually kind of given the credit, the moniker, if you will, as the first Baptist in America. And he does help found, literally, the first Baptist church in America. It's in Providence, Rhode Island. Next time you take a vacation there, I know you're all eager to visit the lovely sights and sounds of Providence, Rhode Island. Recommendation, don't go in November. I did, and it was not fun. But Williams founds the First Baptist Church of Providence, Rhode Island, helps establish the kind of beginnings of the Rhode Island colony, right? And Williams is kind of has many, if not most, of kind of the markers and indicators that we look to in these early historical figures of who is a Baptist. So the part of the trick in this time period is they're not really calling themselves Baptists just yet. So we've got these markers. We're kind of seeing, do they check enough boxes? And Williams checks, almost all the boxes. And what I want to talk about tonight is kind of picking up where we left off with Williams. We're going to spend most of our time talking about John Clarke. But I mentioned real briefly, one of the things that kind of Williams is credited with is his influence of the idea of religious liberty here in the United States. Right, something we kind of take for granted, going all the way back to, let's say, the First Amendment to the Constitution, right? Congress shall not establish a religion, right? Paraphrasing, I had it memorized at one point, but I've slept since then. But essentially, Congress shall make no law establishing a religion, nor hinder the free exercise thereof, right? The first part, the first half of that is called the Establishment Clause, and many credit the writings of early Baptists like Roger Williams for the inclusion of religious liberty early into the DNA of what eventually would become the United States. But if we're talking about the colonial period, particularly in the 1600s, that assumption of religious liberty is just not there. In fact, I would argue that the assumption of a religious liberty is not even really present even after the War of Independence, even into the early decades of the 19th century, of the 1800s. So a lot of people don't realize this, but we point to the First Amendment. We point to this idea of religious liberty in the First Amendment of the Constitution, but what does the text of the Constitution actually say, right? It says, who shall make no law? Congress, right? Congress shall make no law establishing a religion or hindering the free exercise thereof. So that does not apply to states, right? So it's not until at the time of the founding, so the constitutional founding. So when the Constitution of the United States is ratified, right? I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but I'm trying to show you connecting the dots from the Baptist idea of religious liberty to this assumption of religious liberty that we have today, right? At the time of the U.S. Constitution, in the earliest states, 8 of the 13 colonies, now states, had established churches. They had state churches. So if you were a Baptist living in Massachusetts or, Virginia or Carolina or one of the Carolinas, I don't think Georgia was not one of those at that point. But if you're living, 8 of the 13 had established churches. If you're a Baptist living in one of those states, your tax money would actually go to helping pay for the Anglican church, the Congregational, the Puritan church, whatever the established church may be in that particular colony. In fact, and this may blow your mind, I don't know, but it's not until the 1830s that the last state disestablished. In other words, removed a state church from its constitution. It was Massachusetts. It's the persistent Puritans. They're always the last ones to give up, right? But Massachusetts goes all the way until 1830, having a state-sponsored, established church, right? It's not 1830 on the dot, it's 1830-something. But anyway, so I say all that to say this, that when Roger Williams is talking about religious liberty, and what he means by religious liberty is essentially that the state cannot coerce belief, right? So the government cannot say, you have to go to this church. The government cannot say, you have to believe this about baptism. The government can't say, you can't believe this about any kind of particularly theological matter, right? Now, that is an alien notion. It was an alien notion when British Baptists were saying it in England, and it's an alien notion as these early colonialists, right, or colonists, rather, are saying it in the American colonies. So what we need to do is kind of unlatch from our brains that right out of the gate. So this is part of the bad history some of us were taught, particularly when it comes to like the Pilgrims, like these stalwart, they are seeking religious liberty, religious toleration from the evil English, and sure, but they're like the worst ones. When they set up their colony of, what eventually becomes the Massachusetts Bay Colony or the Massachusetts Colony, right? So it's like the Pilgrims that end up becoming some of the worst ones in terms of violating the religious liberty of others, because it's so baked into the cake of kind of the Christian political vision of the day. Does that make sense? Now, we're kind of in the other ditch, I think, today, where we think, a lot of people think that religious opinion has no place in politics, right? So I would say that's like a different ditch. But, we can still avoid this kind of early American ditch of these established churches. So what Williams is trying to do is he's trying to help, at first in the Massachusetts colony, but eventually he gets booted out. He's trying to help these Christians see that the state can't coerce faith. He's not trying to say that Christianity and faith is a personal matter. So this is where modern secularism, kind of modern leftists, try to take history, and particularly the story of Williams and sometimes the story of Baptists, and kind of like bootleg it for their own purposes, right? So what Williams is not saying is that faith is unimportant, and he's not saying that there aren't political realities or political assumptions that come out of Christian faith. Does that make sense? But what he is saying is that the government, the state, cannot coerce faith. And what we mean by that is specifically particular denominational theological sensibilities. Is everybody tracking so far, right? So Roger Williams is probably best known. I think I mentioned this last time, but I want to dig in a little deeper. Roger Williams is best known for writing this work, The Bloody Tenet of Persecution. Now, I know my spelling is bad, but I didn't misspell that. That's how bloody was spelt at that point in 1644. The Bloody Tenet of Persecution. So he writes this theological work. He actually wrote it in one of Williams is kind of like, you think about, well, you found Rhode Island, you're always in Rhode Island. Williams actually kind of ping-ponged back and forth a lot between England and Rhode Island. The Rhode Island would become the Rhode Island colony. In one of his trips to England, while he's kind of promoting a book, he wrote a book, by the way, the first book published in English about Native Americans. Roger Williams was very much a kind of what we would think of as like a supporter, maybe even like almost like an activist of Native American rights, even in the 1600s. So he's on this publication tour of this work, wildly popular in England, and he writes this work, Bloody Tenet, where he's trying to explain, look, you can't, the Christians of his day, the Anglicans, the kind of state church people, they're essentially reading their Bible wrong. It's kind of, I'm summarizing his argument. But he's basically saying what you can't do is assume that modern nations are like Israel in the Old Testament. Right? God is ruling Israel in the Old Testament in a very specific, very particular way. And he doesn't rule England, in his case, England in the same way. Or he doesn't rule the Massachusetts colony in the same way that he ruled Old Testament Israel. And so because of that, the state can't coerce faith. That was part of the reason that figures like Cotton Mather and others in the Massachusetts colony who were more kind of hardcore religious uniformity, everybody must believe the same thing, they would argue that like, this Massachusetts colony, we are like Israel. The American colonies were supposed to be the new Israel, where we could purify the faith, right? And part of that is a uniformity of religion. So the state, think about like Old Testament Israel, tearing down the Asherah poles, destroying Canaanite temples. And so they would make that as an analogy of that into their kind of modern political situation to insist on uniformity of religion. Williams tries to unravel that and say, no, yes, the government, the state is there to, as Romans says, to restrain evil, right? So they do have a function in that regard, to promote good, again, Book of Romans, but not to say you're going to go to jail because you don't have the right view of baptism, and you're going to go to jail because you don't have bishops, or whatever it may be. Is that right? That makes sense? He's trying to unravel those those things, okay? So he makes that argument in the bloody tenet of persecution, and that becomes kind of one of the kind of an early foundational text, particularly in the American context, for religious liberty. We see very similar things being written by British Baptists, but this is kind of the early foundational text amongst really British Baptists in America, right? Now, the trick with Roger Williams, and this is going to be our transition into John Clarke, but the trick with Williams, and I think I mentioned this a little bit last week, but Williams is so much like John Smythe, it's crazy. We talked about John Smythe, like the first English Baptist, right? John Smythe was this trailblazer, but he, what do you call it? Flash in the pan, right? He kind of flashed out early, right? He comes to these Baptist sensibilities. He wants, break away from the established church, believers' baptism, but then he ends up he just keeps on going. And he ends up falling in with the Dutch Mennonites, the Vaterlander Mennonites there in Amsterdam, and gets into some kind of squirrely, that's the technical theological term, some squirrely kind of Christological question marks where he's kind of denying the divinity of Jesus a little bit. Smythe kind of goes off the deep end, right? Williams, very similar. I don't know if it's something about that like entrepreneurial temperament, that you just kind of flash out really quick. Pastor Anthony and I probably, I'm assuming you know some guys like this. Like I know some church planters that were, guys that want to go to a completely unknown area, start a new church, do new work, and sometimes depending on their personalities, they burn themselves through. They flash out real quick. Williams is a lot like Smythe in that regard. Williams, he founds Rhode Island, or co-founds the Rhode Island colony, co-founds First Baptist Church of America in Providence, writes the bloody tenet of persecution, but like Smythe, he kind of doesn't know when to stop. A lot of historians call him the nice word is a seeker, right? He kind of keeps seeking the next thing, the next kind of religious fad almost in some ways. And so where Smythe gets in with the Mennonites and kind of drifts into some Christological heresies, Williams, his seeking leads him to some of the early groups of Quakers that are in the United States and the Rhode Island colony and eventually in other middle colonies. And without getting fully into it, Quakers, again, are kind of they start in England, but they're kind of a branch of the Radical Reformation, part of that tradition. And eventually Williams even gets too radical for the Quakers and actually kind of drifts into some version of Unitarianism where he kind of denies the Trinity, right? So Williams, like Smythe, kind of burns himself out. But in a similar way that I'm much more sympathetic towards Helwys with the early British Baptists, I'm much more sympathetic to a figure like John Clarke amongst the American Baptists. John Clarke was there with Williams almost the entire way in the early days of the Rhode Island colony. He wasn't there quite, I think, at the founding, but was one of the early leaders in the First Baptist Church of America in Rhode Island. But John Clarke is really the one who establishes what I would call, if Williams is the trailblazer, Clarke is the institution builder, right? Every founding movement kind of needs both. You need someone to break the ice, right? You need the exciting entrepreneur who kind of builds the airplane in the air. And then you need the boring kind of fuddy-dud administrator to actually make things like work. Does that make sense? Y'all have probably been in companies that have both of these guys, hopefully. You kind of need them to balance each other out. In some sense, you have a very similar situation with Clarke. So let's talk about John Clarke. So John Clarke, born 1609, dies 1676. Let me grab my coffee here. So Clarke, like Williams, follows this very familiar trajectory that we've seen in several other cases, where Clarke begins established in, he's English, he's from England. I think he's born in Essex, particularly. So he's English, traditional Anglican, eventually kind of comes into the Puritan persuasion. So he spends some time, particularly when he's younger and in England, part of a Puritan congregation. Remember, Puritans early on, especially in England, want to stay within the Church of England, reform it from within. But eventually, Clarke, especially once he gets to America, he moves after school. Clarke pursues a Master of Arts, and then eventually has medical training, basically gets a medical degree, so he's a doctor, but he's also educated in what we would call today like the liberal arts. So he has a background and training in law, history, theology, all the things that good educated people have. And that was a history joke, sorry. And so Clarke has this background. He eventually comes into a kind of a separatist persuasion, especially once he's in Massachusetts. He comes to Massachusetts, particularly to Boston, and attempts to settle there, but he joins with a group of others, kind of these early Baptists that are rejecting infant baptism. Again, they're attempting to separate from even the Puritan Congregationalist churches there in Boston, and kind of comes to a Baptist persuasion, a theological Baptist. Now, Clarke is important because Clarke, again, he's there in the early days of the First Baptist Church of America, but Clarke himself moves on and founds the Second Baptist Church of America in Newport, Rhode Island, right? So he's instrumental in kind of that. This is 1644. Instrumental in founding the Second Baptist Church, again, here in Rhode Island. He's also instrumental. Clarke is also instrumental in, we could almost call it like the second founding of Rhode Island. So Williams founds the original settlement called Providence Plantation. He helps it kind of grow early on, but remember, Williams got permission from Cromwell, right? Cromwell's the Lord Protector, the guy who's running things during the English Civil War. But again, remember from a few weeks ago, eventually Cromwell dies, and the monarchy comes back. Charles II becomes king. And the last thing Charles II wants to do is deal with a radical of radicals like Williams. And so Clarke is the guy who has the legal training, has the education, and has the temperament to actually be able to deal with Charles II himself. And so it's actually Clarke who is able to negotiate the royal charter, in other words, the new royal permission. So the permission had to be kind of re-upped now that we're under new management. The royal charter for Rhode Island. And it's Clarke that's able to negotiate. Now, this is the irony of ironies in this situation. It's Clarke that's able to negotiate an unprecedented, at this point, level of religious liberty built into the royal charter of Rhode Island. Okay? Now, follow with me on that. It's Clarke who manages to talk, and I don't know for sure if he talked with Charles II himself or if this is like an administrator, but at some point the king literally has to sign off on this, right? And so the King of England, Charles II, right, who is as pro-high church, traditional Anglican as you can get, maybe even like a closet Catholic, right? He is willing to sign off on this charter, allowing for as close to absolute religious liberty as you can get in the 13 American colonies, right? And it's Clarke that does that. It's Clarke that's able to pull that off. Does that make sense, right? So, in other words, it's Clarke that allows the religious liberty of Rhode Island and eventually what would be the religious liberty tradition of Baptists that would be kind of baked into the early American experience to last through the 1600s. It makes it into the 1700s because of figures like Clarke, because he was able to actually write religious liberty into the laws of the Rhode Island colony, right? Now, like Williams, Clarke spends time kind of going back and forth between Rhode Island and between England. Again, it's part of he's negotiating these things with Charles II. But there's one particular instance I want to bring up, and one of the main reasons I wanted to bring Clarke up tonight is to have an opportunity to tell you the story of the whipping of Obadiah Holmes, right? So this happens relatively early in Clarke's time in the Rhode Island colony, right? Now, essentially what happens is this. Clarke is pastoring in Newport, Rhode Island, okay? Now, if you don't know your American geography, this is not very far from Massachusetts, right? Remember, Rhode Island was basically carved out of kind of the wildlands of the Massachusetts colony, the kind of the no man's land. Rhode Island's kind of carved out of this. So Rhode Island and the Rhode Island colony, Massachusetts colony are neighbors. And Clarke is pastor here at the church in Newport, and he receives word of a particular individual, William Witter. I don't actually need to write that down, but I will just for fun, because I like names with W's in them. William Witter. Now, William Witter lives not in the Rhode Island colony, but he lives in the Massachusetts colony, specifically in Lynn, 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 Massachusetts. And William Witter is an old man, blind, not able to see, not able, too infirm to travel. But William Whitter has come to kind of Baptist convictions, Baptist sympathies. But there's no Baptist congregations that he can get to in Massachusetts. Remember, they're illegal, right? They're all secret and underground. And the last thing you want is an older blind gentleman trying to figure out, hey, where's the Baptist church? Well, I can't tell you because we'll all die or, be put in jail or something, right? So word gets to Clarke in Rhode Island regarding this gentleman. And so Clarke, as well as a couple others, so you've got John Clarke and then two other individuals, John Crandall. So Clarke, Crandall, and Obadiah Holmes. We don't have enough kids named Obadiah anymore, I think. So Clarke, Crandall, and Holmes essentially take a mission trip to the Massachusetts colony, right, to visit Mr. Whitter, right? And so they do what one does. They go visit Mr. Whitter. They talk to him. They give him Christian encouragement, Christian counsel. Remember, Clarke's a pastor as well as a politician, educated legal expert, these sorts of things. And so Clarke does what else would you do? Clarke has a worship service. It's Sunday. It's the Lord's Day. What do we do on the Lord's Day? We have church. And so Clarke and Holmes and Crandall essentially have church in Mr. Whitter's backyard, and people show up, right? The gospel is proclaimed. Some sources say that there are those that are baptized as believers there at this gathering. So, small town, colonial Massachusetts, church service breaks out in this fella's backyard. What's the problem? What could go wrong? Well, what goes wrong is that they're breaking about a bajillion Massachusetts laws, right? And so in the midst of this, the constables, the police, essentially, for the Massachusetts colony, the constables show up, and they arrest Clarke, Holmes, and Crandall, okay? Now, this is sad and simultaneously hilarious, but the initial punishment for Clarke, Crandall, and Holmes, that I think at this point it's essentially like the local sheriff. The governor's not involved yet, but he will be. But essentially the initial punishment is, all right, fine, you're going to have this fake church service. What we're going to do is we're going to make you go to a real church service. And so the next Sunday, they drag them in chains into the Congregationalist, the Puritan, the Congregationalist church that Sunday, and make them go to, quote-unquote, real church, right? Now, Clarke, Crandall, Holmes, they're in chains. They don't have an option. But it's the little things, right? It's what I call the little rebellions that make it kind of funny to us, to moderns. And in their day, this was a very rebellious sort of event. So Clarke, Crandall, Holmes, they step into church and they refuse to remove their hats. Dun, dun, dun. Now that sounds, okay, what's the big deal? But that was a massive term of disrespect for this church, right? They essentially, what Clarke and Crandall and Holmes were communicating to that congregation is that this is not a real church. Does that make sense? Now, this is their cultural sensibilities, at play here. But this was a visual way of communicating, well, this is just like a gathering of people. Why would I take my hat off? Right? This is not a legitimate New Testament church. And so this is when things go sideways, right? So now the authorities are just, that not only they've conducted this illegal worship service, now they've disrespected the legitimate church of the colony of Massachusetts. The governor of Massachusetts, upon hearing this news, he said that the men, and this is a quotation, deserved death. And he, the governor, would not have such trash in his jurisdiction. So because they didn't tip the hat to the state church. So at this point, Clarke, Crandall, and Holmes are officially legally charged with crimes. Okay? So this is what they're charged with, in case you're interested. They're charged with 1, holding an unauthorized religious meeting. So this is the church that they had at Mr. Witter's home. That's number 1. Number 2, they disrupted an authorized meeting. So they disrupted a true church. This is wearing their hats, right? 3, they administered the sacraments illegally, right? And so this is how we kind of know that they, at some point, they actually baptized believers during their mission trip, during their worship services. Is they baptized someone outside of the normal liturgy of the Congregationalist church. They also, number 4, they maintained, so again, this is Clarke, Crandall, and Holmes, they maintained that the Massachusetts churches were not true churches. Because at this time, this is part of this early Baptist argument. What Williams and Clarke are both arguing is not just that we're kind of doing things right, but they're also arguing that they're doing things so contrary to the New Testament that they're not really New Testament churches, right? And then finally, they are charged with maintaining that infant baptism was false baptism, okay? So these are formal legal charges, right? This is like being charged with a speeding ticket or disturbing the peace or, robbing, a TV from Walmart or something like that, right? These are legal charges with civil penalties, okay? So the 3 men were sentenced without any accuser. So no private individual is actually accusing them of doing these things. This is purely a state action, in other words. And there were no witnesses, no normal citizens, no witnesses to speak out against them. Okay? So what happens is the outcome of the trial, and I think part of this was because they weren't citizens. They weren't part of the Massachusetts colony. But they initially got off relatively light, right? So the trial, Holmes was fined, Obadiah Holmes was fined 30 pounds because he's the one that actually administered the baptism. Clarke, so John Clarke was fined 20 pounds and Crandall was charged 5 pounds. And again, Holmes was given the heaviest fine because he actually administered those baptisms in Lynn, Massachusetts. Now, Clarke and Crandall's fines were actually paid by friends without their knowledge. So Clarke and Crandall actually get out of jail. They were planning on staying in jail and receiving punishment, but Clarke and Crandall's fines were paid for by friends without their knowledge, and so they were let go. So that just left Obadiah Holmes. Now, Holmes refused to pay his fine. Again, he's trying to make a Baptist political, theological argument, and he's essentially saying to the state, I'm not going to pay your fine because, state, you have no jurisdiction over whether I baptize somebody or not. You have no authority over this. Does that make sense, right? So he's not refusing to pay the fine because he's just doesn't, he's too cheap to pay the money, right? This is actually, it doesn't sound like a lot, 30 pounds. It's not $30. I think, if I remember, I calculated the equivalent. I thought I had it in my notes. But if memory serves, this is roughly the equivalent of like 15, 20 grand, something in that neck of the woods, right? So this is a significant fine, right? But he refuses to pay it, not because he's too cheap, but he refuses to pay it on theological grounds. He doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the Massachusetts government to levy this fine, right? That's why he refuses to pay it. So he refuses to pay the fine, then Holmes must pay the penalty another way. So Holmes, on September 5th, 1651, Holmes was taken to the town's whipping post. I don't think we have a whipping post here in Hannibal, but in Lynn, Massachusetts, they did. And so taken to the town's whipping post, and he was sentenced to 30 lashes with a 3-corded whip. And he was beaten very badly. Blood, bruises, tearing of the flesh. In later recountings, it said that he told the magistrates, he told the judges that were there, he said, Obadiah Holmes says, "You have struck me as with roses." And he claimed to have felt no pain during the incident. Now, that being said, it's also recorded that he could only sleep by resting on his knees and elbows for very many days afterwards, right? Now, later, Rhode Island Governor Joseph Jenkins, he would write about this incident, and Governor Jenkins would say, "Those who have seen the scars on Mr. Holmes' back, which the old man was wont to call the marks of Lord Jesus, have expressed a wonder that he should live." Right? So again, this is every indication, historically speaking, there's every indication that this is an accurate and true event, right? If you want, you can Google. There's a really famous kind of it's not really a painting. It's a wood cutting, but a painted wood cutting. You could paint, just like painting whipping of Obadiah Holmes, and you could see this great portrait of him kind of being prepared to be tied to the whipping post, kind of looking off into the distance, very kind of Fox's Book of Martyrs-esque sort of situation here. And so Holmes is an example, along with Clarke and along with Crandall. This is, I tell this story partially because it's a fascinating story, and it's a much needed story for us to hear and see and experience, even generationally separated as we are, to see the importance of the idea of religious liberty to Baptists, not just in Britain, but also in America as well. You have individuals, and Obadiah Holmes is just one example, right? There are scores of examples of other Baptists in other colonies that are regularly facing persecution of various kinds. Everything from imprisonment to public beatings to fines to exile, sometimes even to death itself, right? So Obadiah Holmes is just one example of early Baptist commitment to religious liberty, okay? So John Clarke, I would give Clarke maybe a little more credit as being, let's say at least, the first established Baptist in the American colonies, or maybe at least the first one that it actually sticks, right? Now, a couple others that we can mention, kind of early New England Baptists, real quick, just got 3 or 4 minutes left, but a few others I want to mention. So eventually you do get someone who's able to really in secret found a church in Boston itself. You have the First Baptist Church of Boston, was founded by an individual named Thomas Gould. He and his wife refused to attend the congregational worship. They wouldn't present their child for baptism. Eventually, Gould, that's G-O-U-L-D, Gould would form a church with other anti-Paedo-Baptist families in his home. Eventually, they got too many to meet in his home in secret. And so, this would be, there's kind of a romantic feeling to this. Not romantic in the like romance, but in like the imaginative sense. But eventually they started a church. They started meeting in an island in Boston Harbor, like they would like rowboat out to this kind of, you could just imagine this like secluded wildernessy island out in the middle of Boston Harbor, and that's where really the First Baptist Church of Boston kind of started there in this little island out in the middle of Boston Harbor. Now I mentioned First Baptist Church of Boston because one of the things that happens here that doesn't happen in Rhode Island until much later is Gould and his church adopts a confession of faith in 1665. And this is probably, we don't know for sure because this is really just kind of the earliest one we have a record on, but it's probably the first, if not one of the very earliest Baptist confessions kind of written on what eventually becomes American soil, right? This confession borrows very heavily from other earlier British confessions, especially those in the kind of particular Baptist strand. But this is kind of 1665 is one of the earliest Baptist confessions you have. Another individual, and again, I'm going through these real briefly, but just to kind of give you a sense that more is happening out amongst Baptists outside of just Rhode Island. You also have William Scriven and the Kittery Church. Now, the Kittery Church is interesting, I think. It's founded in Maine, right? So here we have Kittery, Maine. This church is founded in 1682. Scriven is actually ordained in the First Baptist Church of Boston. So he's almost like a missionary that is ordained at the First Baptist Church of Boston, meeting on their creepy island, right? And he's sent to establish a church in Maine. Now, Scriven did and that's 1682. Now, Scriven did what I think any sane, rational person would do after having moved to Maine and living there for several years, is he left and went to somewhere significantly warmer. Now, think about this, guys. So this church in Maine, this Kittery Church, called the Kittery Church in Maine, they moved. The whole church moved, right? The whole church moved from Kittery, Maine to Charleston, South Carolina in 1696. And so this is kind of the beginnings of what eventually will become the First Baptist Church of Charleston, which is one of the earliest churches in the South, right? So you actually have a church in Maine, ups and moves to Charleston, South Carolina. Now, it's not just the climate. I was being funny. It's persecution, which is not funny. But they up and move, and it's also there's some economic factors in there as well. The Carolinas become, in the late 1600s, the Carolina colonies become kind of an economic powerhouse of the South. The Southern colonies really kind of begin to kind of stand on their own 2 feet by that point. And so the Kittery Church moves to Charleston in 1696 and eventually becomes the First Baptist Church of Charleston, which is kind of the first Baptist church in the South, or what eventually we would call the South. So it is 1601, and I really, really want to tell you the story of Elias Keach, but I also don't want to rush it. So I'm going to hold you in suspense. Elias Keach has an amazing story, one of my favorite ones in this whole class. So if you want to hear this, don't Google it, don't Wikipedia it or whatever between now and then. Save it for next Sunday. So next Sunday, I'm going to tell you the story of Elias Keach. And Elias Keach kind of begins our story of Baptists in the middle colonies. Remember how we talked about American colonies being in 3 regions? You have the New England colonies in the north, you have the southern colonies in the south, and what do we call the ones in the middle? The middle colonies. There you go, right? Well done. You've all done better than most of the freshmen in my American history class. So, the middle colonies there in the middle. So Elias Keach is one of the leading figures in the beginning of Baptist life in the middle colonies. So this is particularly Pennsylvania, New Jersey, this area as well. Phenomenal story. Save it for next Sunday. Don't look it up and spoil it. Anyway, all right. So that being said, any questions, thoughts, comments? All right. Excellent. Thank you all so much for your time this evening. What a blessing it is to be with you on this Lord's Day. Y'all have a great week. Thank you.